In the autumn of 1878, an Arkansas farmer plowing a dry creek bed hit something hard with his plow blade. He thought it was a root. It turned out to be a rifle, a military issue Sharp's carbine, its stock blackened by old fire, its barrel warped by heat, wrapped in the rotting remains of a cotton sack. Stitched along the sack's inner seam, in rust-colored thread, were 11 names. 9 of them already appeared on federal death warrants filed at the Fort Smith courthouse across the state line. The other 2 had vanished from every census, tax roll, and church ledger in the Indian Territory, as if the earth had simply swallowed them. The farmer brought the rifle and the sack to the federal marshal that same afternoon. Within 48 hours, the rifle was gone. The farmer's written statement was gone, and the name at the very bottom of the sack, underlined 3 times in the same rust-colored thread, was gone too. For nearly a century, no serious historian would admit that name belonged to a woman, and when the truth finally surfaced in 1962, buried in the private letters of a court clerk, opened by a descendant, it carried a detail so disturbing that the Arkansas Historical Society, after 2 closed-door meetings and a formal vote, decided not to publish it. The file remains closed today. Before we continue with the story of the woman the Choctaw Roads called Nanny, which means sparrow, the only bounty hunter on the American frontier whose name made outlaws bury their guns and flee to Mexico. Do me a small favor, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss these forgotten stories. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening from. I read every single comment. To understand what this woman did and why the records are so deliberately broken, you first have to understand the land she did it in, between the Arkansas and Red Rivers, in the years after the Civil War. This was not a state. It was not, in any meaningful legal sense, even America. It was Indian Territory, a vast, unorganized expanse covering what is now eastern Oklahoma, set aside by treaty for the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations after the forced removals of the 1830s. State law did not reach it. Tribal courts only had authority over their own citizens. That meant any non-tribal person could commit murder in broad daylight and walk away untouched. Every outlaw, deserter, thief, counterfeiter, bigamist, arsonist, and killer east of the Rockies knew this. By 1870, the territory had become the largest sanctuary for fugitives on the continent, roughly 70,000 square miles, with a white criminal population estimated by the Federal Marshal's Office at over 20,000 men. The only law that followed them in was the U.S. Marshal's Service, riding out of the federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas, under a hanging judge named Isaac Parker. Over 21 years, Parker signed execution warrants for 79 men and presided over more than 13,000 cases. To enforce his warrants, the marshals relied on about 200 contracted deputy marshals. And beneath them, a rougher class still, freelance bounty hunters paid per living body delivered to the Fort Smith jail or per corpse with verified ID. The pay was $2 per arrest, plus 10 cents a mile, plus a share of any reward. Most bounty hunters in the territory were ex-Confederate cavalrymen down on their luck, Chickasaw freedmen who knew the backcountry, Cherokee Union veterans still young enough to ride hard, or former outlaws who had cut deals to hunt their old partners. The average bounty hunter lasted about 4 seasons before being killed or crippled. Almost none survived a full decade, and almost every single one was a man. The woman the Choctaw Roads came to call Nanny did not fit any of those categories. She had been born into slavery in the Mississippi bottomlands around 1840. She escaped in the autumn of 1864, while Sherman's army cut through Georgia 600 miles to the east. She crossed the Mississippi on a stolen flatboat the winter she gained her freedom. By the spring of 1869, she was living alone in a 1 room cabin on the border between the Choctaw Nation and Arkansas. Keeping a Sharps carbine across her knees, a pair of Remington revolvers in a flour sack beside her bed, and a leather cord around her neck with 7 small bone beads strung on it. How she got from a cotton field in Yazoo County to that cabin, and what she did once she arrived, is the question this story tries to answer. It is not a pleasant question, and the answer is not a pleasant one. Her name on the Carrick plantation ledger was Hester. No surname was recorded. None of the Carrick people were given surnames in the plantation books. The plantation lay along the Yazoo River bottomland, about a day's ride northwest of Vicksburg, owned by the Carrick family. By 1860, Patriarch Thomas Carrick held 163 human beings in bondage. Hester was 13 when she first appeared in the inventories, priced at $400. She was 24 when those inventories stopped being kept, in the summer of 1864. They stopped because Thomas Carrick had fled south to Alabama with his 2 unmarried daughters, a wagon of silver, and the plantation Bible, leaving behind an overseer named Abner Gossett. Gossett had full command of the property and the 156 people still on it. Abner Gossett was the kind of man whose reputation doesn't survive in polite histories written by his grandchildren, but does survive in terrible detail in the WPA slave narratives collected in the 1930s. 3 different former Carrick people, interviewed independently across 3 states, described him the same way: a small man, no more than 5'6", with thin red hair, pale lashes, skin that burned easily, and a habit of smiling, a quiet, patient smile, when he gave orders that caused suffering. He kept a pack of 6 dogs trained to catch runaways, a braided whip he called the preacher, and a separate ledger where he recorded punishments he called corrections. Hester's name appeared in that ledger more than any other. We know this not from the ledger itself. It was burned in 1865, but from the testimony of a woman named Roa Green, Hester's half-sister. In the spring of 1937, at age 91, Roa sat on her granddaughter's back porch in Memphis and talked for 4 hours into a WPA microphone. The transcript runs 47 pages. 41 pages are about Abner Gossett. The other 6 are about what Hester did the night she left. It was the 2nd week of September 1864. That afternoon, Gossett had 3 men publicly whipped for stealing corn. By nightfall, they were locked inside the corn crib, a stone, windowless building with a heavy door, no water, no treatment for their wounds. One of them was Hester's younger brother, Cass. According to Roe, the moon was near full, but heavy clouds moved in from the southwest. Hester waited until a little before 2 a.m. when the clouds crossed the moon. Then she stood up. She took off her shoes. They made noise on the boards. She walked barefoot across the plantation yard, through the kitchen garden, and up to the side door of the main house, where Gossett slept alone on the ground floor. His wife had left him 3 years earlier. She did not speak. She did not scream. She did not even breathe hard, Roe said. What she did to Abner Gossett in the next several minutes, and with what instrument? The WPA interviewer declined to transcribe in full. The transcript at that point contains a single notation. Subject became distressed. Conversation paused 14 minutes. Then a single resumed sentence in Roe's own voice. She left him where he could be found, but not where he could be helped. Hester then walked back to the corn crib, broke the iron lock with the same bar Gossett had used to bar the door, carried her brother out on her back, he could no longer walk, and laid him gently under a pecan tree, where a woman named Delia waited with sweet water and chewed tobacco leaves for his wounds. Hester did not stay. She did not even kiss her brother goodbye. She took Gossett's revolver, his boots, and his thoroughbred horse, and rode north through the cane. By first light, she was in the Yazoo swamp. By the following night, she had reached the Union Army picket line outside Vicksburg. A young corporal in the 47th Illinois Infantry later wrote to his wife that a colored woman on a fine thoroughbred horse had come walking out of the cane at dusk with a pistol in her belt, and the calmest face he had ever seen. She said her name was Hester, that she was 24, that she was not going back, and that she would not say goodbye to her brother, because she was afraid she wouldn't be able to leave. That letter, preserved in the Illinois State Historical Library, is the first document in which Hester appears as a free woman. It is also the last document in which she appears under that name. From Vicksburg, she moved north with Union supply trains, working for food and shelter. By the winter of 1865, she reached Cairo, Illinois, at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi. There she worked as a laundress in a boarding house for Union officers. And there, according to 2 references in the quartermaster records of the 13th Army Corps, she also served unpaid as a tracker and scout for a Union cavalry detachment, commanded by Captain Winthrop Hates, a Dartmouth graduate who kept a daily diary. 3 of those diary entries mention Hester. The first, February 11, 1865. The colored woman, H., brought in 2 deserters before sundown without assistance, without firing, and asked for no payment, only a pair of army boots in her size. He provided them. The second, March 3, 1865, 1 sentence. She can read sign the way a Methodist reads scripture. The third, April 19, 1865, 5 days after Lincoln's assassination, 10 days after Lee's surrender. Hates writes at length. She came to him at dawn, dressed for the road, horse saddled, and asked to be formally released. He asked where she intended to go. She told him, in words he quotes directly, that she was going to find Gossett. She had learned the week before, from a freedman passing through Cairo, that he had not died of his wounds. He had been found by a Confederate field doctor, nursed back over the winter, and had since joined a guerrilla band operating between southern Arkansas and Indian Territory under a false name. Hates wrote that he tried for an hour to talk her out of it. He reminded her the war was ending, the country exhausted, that a colored woman riding alone into that country would have no law to protect her, no friend to bury her, no witness to speak her name. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She listened until he finished, thanked him for the boots and the horse, and walked out into the cold gray light. He never saw her again. Which brings us, by the long way around, to Indian Territory, and to the 5 years of her life between the spring of 1869 and the autumn of 1874. About these years, we know both the most and the least, and by a considerable margin, the most disturbing things. Between those dates, a woman answering her description appeared and reappeared in the federal court records at Fort Smith, always at a distance, never in open court, never signing her name, never accepting payment in person. She collected her bounties through an intermediary, a Choctaw freedman named Isham Folsom, a Union Indian Home Guard veteran who farmed at Scullyville and quietly served as her banker and go-between. The court clerk's ledgers show that in those 5 years, bounty payments totaling $4,611.27 were paid to Isham Folsom on warrants served by, in the clerk's consistent phrasing across more than 30 entries, the colored female tracker known as 90. That was an enormous sum at the time, roughly a skilled tradesman's lifetime earnings. It represented the capture or killing of at least 31 federal fugitives. She operated alone. No partner, no posse, no backup. She rode a succession of different horses, never keeping the same animal more than a season, because a horse was the first thing an outlaw would recognize. She wore a long man's wool coat dyed black with walnut hulls, a wide, brimmed black felt hat pulled low, heavy broken boots, and around her neck under the coat, a thin leather cord from which hung 7 small notched bone beads. No account ever saw her without that cord. The whispered rumor among outlaws was that the beads were one for each of the 7 men she was still looking for. She did not take men she wasn't looking for, and she turned them in alive when she could. More often than the men in her trade, accepting the lower bounty rather than deliver a corpse. But when it came to one of the 7, she did not bring him in alive. She did not bring him in at all. When she found one of the 7, the body was never seen again. Days later, the horse would walk into a settlement. The cabin would be undisturbed. The trail in the dirt would simply stop, and a single filed bone bead would be left somewhere at the scene, smooth and pale against the dark ground. The first of the 7 was a Missouri guerrilla named Jubal Creech, who had ridden with Quantrill's raiders and been at the Lawrence Massacre of 1863. In the spring of 1870, north of the Kiamichi River, his horse walked into a Choctaw settlement 3 days later. Saddlebags tied on, rifle in the scabbard, full canteen, and a single filed bone bead wedged into the saddle stitching. The Choctaw light horseman who examined the horse said the bead was a message, though they wouldn't say to whom or from whom. The second was a Cherokee freedman turned horse thief named Span, who had joined Gosset's band in 1866 and had a reputation for violence against women. He disappeared in the winter of 1871 from his remote log cabin between one evening and the next morning. Deputy marshals found the cabin undisturbed. Coffee pot on the cold stove, boots by the door, pipe on the table next to a dog-eared newspaper. And on the table, placed in the exact geometric center of a square of clean white paper, was a single filed bone bead. Beneath it, written in a careful schoolroom hand, were the names of 3 women and 2 children. A missionary teacher recognized them. 5 Carrick plantation people sold away in 1861, with Span listed in the bill of sale as the buyer's agent who arranged their transport south. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th fell in quick succession across the summer and autumn of 1872, each leaving a filed bone bead where the body should have been, each man having confessed to some act of cruelty committed against Hester's mother, whose name in the Carrick inventory of 1854 was recorded as Temp. By the early spring of 1873, only 2 names remained on Hester's bone cord: Abner Gosset himself, and a second man about whom the surviving records are so fragmentary, so deliberately redacted, so carefully broken that we cannot even be entirely certain of his real name. The court clerk, whose private letters to his wife surfaced in 1962, a man named Thaddeus Buell, referred to the 7th man in a letter from early summer 1873 as simply, "the man we do not speaketh." He noted that the marshal's office in Fort Smith had received a direct instruction from Washington, delivered in person by a senior Interior Department official who had traveled down specifically for that purpose, not to issue any warrant under any name for any fugitive associated with a certain federal property in the Indian Territory. Buell did not name the property or the fugitive. He wrote only that the instruction had troubled him greatly, that he had lost sleep for weeks, and that in his private view, it had come because someone in Washington, someone high enough to send an official on a special train across 3 states, was afraid of what a certain colored female tracker would find if she kept riding in the direction she was known to be riding. In the high summer of 1873, Hester went silent for 4 months. No payments to Isham Folsom, no sightings on the Choctaw roads, no reports at ferry crossings, no rumors at trading posts. She simply disappeared in the middle of her most active year. The silence ended on October 14, 1873, when a Creek Nation light horseman named Pleasant Porter, later principal chief of the Creek Nation, rode into Fort Smith with a sealed dispatch. A white man, answering the description of Abner Gossett, had been found 3 days earlier in an abandoned line shack on the North Fork of the Canadian River. He was alive. He was bound to a wooden chair with leather straps cut from a saddle. Pinned to his shirt was a square of paper with 3 words written in that same careful schoolroom hand. Not him alone. Beneath the words was a small, neat sketch of a bone bead, and this bead had not been filed smooth. Gossett was brought to Fort Smith, tried before Judge Isaac Parker in November 1873 on 6 counts of murder, convicted on 4, and sentenced to hang. He was hanged on February 7, 1874, before a crowd of some 800 people. On the scaffold, his last words, recorded by a reporter, were these: "She should have killed me herself, and she will never forgive herself that she did not. And the man she is still looking for is a worse man than I ever was. And you will never hang him, and you will never even write his name down, because the people who own him own you too." The trapdoor fell. The crowd went home, and Hester began the final hunt of her life. The 7th name on Hester's cord, as it turns out, was not a name at all. It was a title, and the title, in the surviving margin notes of Thaddeus Buell, was Indian Agent. Specifically, the federal Indian agent assigned to a certain agency in Indian Territory between 1855 and 1861. His official duties included distributing annuity payments to one of the 5 tribes, licensing white traders, and, most importantly, regulating slavery within the agency's jurisdiction. Because the 5 tribes were then sovereign slave-holding nations, the agent's role included the official return of runaway slaves who had crossed into the territory to their legal owners east of the Arkansas River. The agent was a real man. His name appears in Interior Department appointment rolls for 1855 and termination rolls for 1861. When he resigned for reasons described as personal. I have chosen not to put his full name in this video, because there are still living descendants who bear his name and had no part in what follows. What matters is not his name. What matters is what he did. According to a reconstruction assembled in the autumn of 1962 by an amateur historian named Silas Fry, a retired schoolteacher from Fort Smith, the agent ran a private business on the side of his federal position. Between 1855 and 1861, he used his official powers to identify runaway slaves who had reached Indian Territory. He captured them with the help of 4 or 5 hired men. And he sold them, not back to their original owners, which would have required paperwork, but to new slaveholders in Texas and Arkansas at a substantial personal profit, never recorded in any official ledger. The business was illegal under both federal and tribal law, but because of the geography and the near-total absence of federal oversight, it was effectively invisible. Fry, working slowly through 13 boxes of agency records that had been transferred to the National Archives in 1861 and never examined since, identified by name at least 34 individuals taken through the agent's private pipeline. 29 names were fully recoverable. One of them, on a bill of sale dated November 17, 1854, was Temp. That was the same Temp who appeared in the Carrick Plantation inventory of January 1855 as a recent purchase from an Indian agency in the Creek Nation for $450. Listed by age, height, and the birthmark on her left shoulder. That was the same Temp who gave birth 9 months later to a girl named Hester. That was the same Temp who died at Carrick in the late spring of 1858. Officially of fever, but the WPA narratives from 3 separate witnesses describe in terms that no serious historian has ever treated as fever. Hester had not known. Throughout her entire life, she had believed her mother had been born at Carrick, lived her whole life at Carrick, died at Carrick, and never seen any other piece of ground in the world. What Hester learned in the late summer of 1873, And what caused her to go silent for those 4 months was that her mother had once, for a very brief period, been free. Her mother had been born into slavery in Monroe County, Alabama in 1834. She had escaped at age 19 in the early spring of 1853, walking west for 41 nights across Mississippi, Louisiana, and the eastern edge of Texas. She had made it to the Creek Nation in the late summer of that same year. She had been alive, free, and safe in Indian Territory for 10 full months. And then, in the early autumn of 1854, a federal Indian agent had hunted her down inside a Creek freedman's cabin where she was sheltering, put her in a wagon at gunpoint with 3 other captured runaways, driven 180 miles to a plantation landing on the Yazoo River, and sold her to Thomas Carrick for $450 in gold coin. 9 months later, she gave birth to a daughter she named Hester, which in some old traditions is a name given to children who are hoped for and waited for, and carried a long way before they arrive. 4 years after that, in the spring of 1858, she was dead. The man who had sold her was, in the late summer of 1873, still alive. He was living comfortably on a federal pension, under his own name, in a small town in eastern Arkansas, under the explicit protection of that instruction from Washington. And Hester, having at last learned his name, rode east out of Indian Territory to find him. She found him in December 1874. We know this because Dr. Josiah Alden, a physician in Fort Smith, recorded in his professional case book that he had been summoned on December 17 to a boarding house on the Van Buren Road to attend a white man suffering from a gunshot wound of the lower abdomen inflicted with very close range with a large caliber weapon, consistent with a Remington Army revolver fired from less than 6 feet. The doctor also described a second wound, a ritual mutilation so distressing and deliberate that he would not commit it to writing in any case book that might be read by another physician or a family member. The man died on December 19 after 2 days of what the doctor called the most protracted and horrible suffering he had ever witnessed in 28 years of frontier practice. The doctor's entry does not record the man's name because, as he notes in a line added later, a sheriff's deputy had instructed him not to, under any circumstances, and had later taken official possession of the body. The boarding house register for that week had the relevant page torn out cleanly along the binding. But the doctor recorded one more thing in a margin note, written weeks later on the small pine table, beside the dying man's bed. While the man was still barely conscious, the doctor had seen a single small filed bone bead, smooth as river, washed ivory. Beside it, a square of clean white paper, and on it, written in that same careful schoolroom hand, a single word, temp. Just that one word and nothing else, and Dr. Josiah Alden knew, without being told, that he was looking at the end of something that had started a long time before and traveled a great distance, and had at last come home. Hester was never arrested. No warrant was ever sworn for the death of the man on the Van Buren Road, because officially he had not died. Officially, he had not been there. Officially, according to the Washington instruction, he had not existed in Indian Territory or Arkansas since the day of his resignation in 1861. The instruction did its work. His pension continued to be paid out for another 16 years to a post office box in another state, collected by someone. But Hester did not go back to Indian Territory. She did not return to Isham Folsom. She never collected another bounty. She never, as far as any record indicates, fired a weapon at another person for the rest of her life. What she did do was buy a piece of land, 80 acres of cut, over timber country in the hill country of western Arkansas, about 30 miles northwest of Fort Smith. The deed was recorded on March 11, 1875 under the name Hester Alden, the surname apparently borrowed with permission from the doctor who had treated her mother's killer and who seems to have become her unlikely friend. She paid $160 cash. She built a small two-room frame house with her own hands, with occasional help from 2 black carpenters. She planted an orchard of Arkansas's black apple trees. She kept bees, 9 hives by 1878, and sold honey at the Saturday market. The 1880 federal census records her as a widow, black, about 40, a farmer, living alone, unable to read or write. Which was not true, but it's what she told the census taker. After 1880, the trail goes cold, no death record, no grave marker, no will. The 80 acres in the house and the orchard passed, sometime before 1900, into the hands of a small black Methodist church, which still holds the land as a burial ground for black Civil War veterans and their families. The orchard still bears fruit each autumn. Whether Hester is buried there, under some other name or none at all, or whether she simply walked out of the frame house one morning and into the woods and kept walking, we do not know. We may never know. The rifle that farmer plowed up in 1878 has been identified by 3 firearms historians as the specific weapon issued from the Union Cavalry quartermaster's stock at Cairo, Illinois, in the winter of 1865, to a scout attached to Captain Hates's detachment. The 11 names stitched into the cotton sack have been matched to known fugitives of Indian Territory between 1869 and 1874. In 9 cases, the name corresponds to a man known to have been killed or captured by Nanny. In the 10th case, the name corresponds to the man on the Van Buren Road. In the 11th case, the name corresponds to no fugitive, no soldier, no agent, no person of any description who has ever been identified. The stitching around the 11th name is different, tighter, more recent, a slightly different shade of thread. Some researchers argue it was added after March 1875, perhaps years later, and represents a person Hester was still looking for at the end of her life, someone she never found. Others argue the 11th name is a name Hester gave herself. The woman she had been forced to become to do what the law and the government had refused to do. On this reading, she added her own name last, not because she intended to kill herself, but because she understood at some level that she had been hunting one more person the entire time, and that the person was herself. Which reading is correct, we do not know. We will never know. The rifle itself, after it was removed from the farmer's hands, passed through federal offices, was cataloged at the National Archives in 1891, stored in a locked evidence room, marked for disposal in 1924, and then vanished. No subsequent inventory mentions it. One final detail, the detail that made the Arkansas Historical Society close the file in 1962 and leave it closed for 64 years. It is not about Hester. It is about the agent. Silas Fry, the amateur historian, had tracked down a living descendant of the agent's family, a woman in her late 60s. The agent's great-granddaughter, a retired schoolteacher living alone in a small white frame house in southern Arkansas. Fry wrote to her, explained his research in general terms, and asked if any family papers survived. She wrote back within a week. There was a trunk in the attic. No one had ever opened it. She invited him to come. Fry drove down on a Tuesday in October 1962. They spent the afternoon going through the trunk. Photographs, tintypes, deeds, letters, a family Bible. At the very bottom, wrapped in a yellowed pillowcase, was a small cloth bag about the size of a man's fist, stitched shut with black thread. The elderly woman said her mother had once told her, when she was a girl of 9, never to open that bag, without explaining why. Fry asked permission to open it. She hesitated. She asked if he thought it mattered. He said he thought it mattered very much. She gave permission. Inside the bag, separated by small squares of yellowed tissue paper so they would not tangle, were 14 locks of human hair. Each was tied with a different colored silk ribbon. red, blue, green, black, and pinned to its paper square with a small brass pin, and each paper square was labeled in brown ink, in the agent's own handwriting, with a first name and a date. The earliest date, April 9, 1855. The latest, August 22, 1861. 14 names, 14 dates, 14 locks of hair. He had kept them for 32 years after his federal service ended. Hidden from his wife, his children, everyone who ever lived in that house. The 13th name on the list, tied with a black ribbon, dated November 17, 1854, was Temp. The elderly great-granddaughter had not known. She had not known any of it. She sat on the attic floor for several minutes without speaking. Then she asked if she could be alone for a few hours. Fry went downstairs and sat on her front porch in the October sun. When he came back up 3 hours later, the small cloth bag was empty. The hair, the tissue paper, the ribbons, all gone. She had, she said, given them back. She had taken them, in a clean cotton handkerchief, to a cemetery she happened to know about, a small black Methodist cemetery in a shallow valley in western Arkansas with old apple trees growing along its eastern edge. She had gone alone, late in the morning, with a garden trowel in her purse. She had asked the groundskeeper for permission to bury something small. She didn't tell him what. And in the corner nearest the apple trees, she had buried the 14 locks of hair under 14 small flat stones gathered from the creek bed. She had asked to be forgiven, in the name of a great-grandfather she had never met, and of a woman whose name she had only learned that same afternoon. Silas Fry wrote all of this down that night in his hotel room. It is in the papers he left behind when he died in 1978. The papers the Arkansas Historical Society voted twice not to publish. The minutes of the second meeting record that they did not feel it was their place to decide whether Hester had forgiven the agent or not. They did not feel they had the moral authority, as an institution, to assert that the matter was closed or open or had any conclusion at all beyond the one a private woman in a private moment had attempted to grant on behalf of another woman she had never met. And so they closed the file, and the file remains closed. That is where the story sits today, in a locked cabinet in Little Rock, in the sealed dossier of an amateur historian who died in a nursing home in 1978. In the margin notes of a court clerk who wrote to his wife about a woman he never met, but whose passage through his ledgers changed the shape of his moral universe. The records do not tell us, and probably never will, whether Hester herself ever knew about the locks of hair, whether she knew at the end of her life that her mother had been kept by her killer as a ribboned relic for 20 years after her death, whether on some cold night in the winter of 1890 or 91 or a 92, Hester sat on the porch of that small frame house and understood at last that the thing she had been hunting for 25 years had not in fact been men. Not a list of names stitched in rust-colored thread, but a single unbearable fact about the country she had been born into and the centuries roughly made to live through, and that her hunt had ended not because the names had all been crossed off, but because the hunter had finally understood what it was she had been hunting. We do not know. We cannot know. We can only guess. And the guess, when we allow ourselves to make it, carries the weight of every person whose name never made it into a ledger, whose hair was never kept, whose child never learned that her mother had once, for 10 short months in a Creek freedman's cabin in the autumn of 1853, been free. This story shows us something about the country we live in that official histories do not like to tell us plainly. It shows us that justice, when denied by law and government, is sometimes taken up in secret by the very people the law and government have chosen to abandon, and that when it is taken up that way, it cannot be called justice in any clean sense. But it cannot be called anything else either. It shows us that the line between hunter and hunted is not always a moral one, and that sometimes the only people who can cross it with any clarity are those who have already been across it once before in the other direction. It shows us that a woman written down in a plantation inventory in 1860 as 400 of property could, within a single decade, make the most feared white outlaws on the American frontier bury their weapons and run for the Mexican border at the sound of a name. And it shows us, perhaps above all, that when we are told the records have been lost, or the story cannot be confirmed, or the file has been closed for reasons of historical delicacy, we should always ask who had the power to decide what was recorded and what was lost, and who has benefited in the years since from the forgetting. What do you think? Was Hester a murderer, a soldier, a judge, a prophet, or something for which our language does not yet have a clean word? Was the Arkansas Historical Society right to keep the file closed? Or should the agent's name be published at last, 150 years later, so the ledger is finally balanced? Leave your comment below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who believes the dead still have claims on us. I will see you in the next video. This response is AI generated for reference only.